Good morning to you, Mr. Spencer.
Good morning, Joe. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. Thank you for being on with us today. I wish we had good news to talk about, but unfortunately we don't. Over the weekend, on Sunday, the Feast of Pentecost, of course, 50 Nigerians were murdered at Holy Mass. Tell us about this story.
Yeah, it's a terrible story, Joe. Blood on the altar, people right in the middle of the Mass. It was actually at the sign of peace, and people stood up. They had disguised themselves as members of the congregation, and they began shooting indiscriminately. The death toll, according to some accounts in Nigeria, is over 100, although, as you noted, the international wire services have said over 50. In any case, it's terrible either way,
Mm.
and it's even worse in light of the fact that eyewitnesses have reported that the shooters were Fulani herdsmen, which would mean that they were Islamic jihadis.
Yeah. I mean, this story continues to baffle me because the West just does never seem to care too much about what happens to Catholic Nigerians, Christian Nigerians that are being slaughtered at the hands of these Muslims. I mean, so long as we get our solar panels and whatever else we want out of Africa, we don't care much beyond that. Why do you think that is?
I think that there's an unconscious or unadmitted racism involved in this, quite seriously. I mean, I think that there's quite a lot of hysteria about racism today, and so I don't make the charge lightly. But we saw this when war broke out in Ukraine, and people saying this is different from a war zone in Africa or somewhere. And I thought, why? Why is it
Why?
different?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
And so I think that there is a certain sense that those people are just going to act that way. And so these kinds of things are dismissed. If the coverage out of Nigeria were just and proportionate, then it would be headline news practically every day. There is a genocide of Christians going on with Islamic jihad groups, including the Islamic State, ISIS, and others, attacking Christians virtually every day.
Mr. Spencer, there was another article that came out I think it might have been a day before this happened, that described President Buhari, who's a Fulani Muslim as well, president of Nigeria, that he was sending or providing guards to churches, Christian churches, but he wasn't giving them bullets. Do you know anything about that?
I haven't heard about that, but I know that there have been multiple charges that Buhari, being a Fulani, and the Fulani jihadis being one of the principal attackers of the Christian communities in Nigeria, he has not acted with any dispatch to stop this. There's been a lot of lip service, a lot of boasting, as a matter of fact, that these groups are on the ropes, that they're about to be eliminated altogether, when actually there are repeated charges from Christian leaders in Nigeria, and these are growing more frequent, that Buhari is actually on the side of the jihadis and wants these kinds of attacks. Now, this is something I'm not saying, it's something that Nigerian leaders have been saying in the Christian community.
As a follow-up, what is the Fulani angle? We hear that word, maybe we just don't make a connection or understand what that is. Is that a particular kind of denomination of Muslim, or what is that, a Fulani?
No, the Fulani is a tribe in the Fula tribe in Nigeria, and they're 99% Muslim. And multiple eyewitnesses have attested after these various attacks that they are engaged in a jihad to drive the Christians out of the areas where they live and to take the land that they occupy. And this is ultimately in service of establishing an Islamic State in Nigeria.
Let me go back to a follow-up question a minute ago. So the reports that we did see, and there were very few actual mainstream media reports on this story over the course of Sunday into Monday. They're reporting at 50. 50 is that number. But you're saying your sources are showing even more than that. Why do you figure there's such a discrepancy there?
Well, I think in the first place, after any kind of attack of this magnitude, there's a lot of confusion and it takes some time. You have to deal with all the wounded. Some people die of the wounds afterward and so on. And so that's not necessarily anything going on there
I see.
to minimize the number. On the other hand, there may be. because every time there is an Islamic Jihad attack, we see in the establishment media obfuscation about the perpetrators. And we see it here as well, that they have been identified in the international media, actually not identified in the international media, as unknown gunmen and so on, completely ignoring. I just read a report moments ago, as a matter of fact, that said there's nothing tying the Fulani to this attack. Well, actually, a Christian leader in Nigeria has specifically said this shows that we have to deal with this Fulani problem on a national basis. And eyewitnesses in the church were reported as saying they were Fulani. So to say there's no evidence that Fulani are involved in this is a flat falsehood that's being spread by the international media. And in a similar way, there's also an interest in diminishing the number of casualties, because there is, if you go through jihad coverage over the years, you see there's an intentional effort to obfuscate it and to minimize it.
I was reading in a Breitbart story covering this, and it said, quote, Vanguard interviewed survivors and eyewitnesses of the attack. One anonymous source told the newspaper that the gunmen, estimated to number 4 or 5, disguised themselves as worshipers before ambushing the church. Close quote. That was from Breitbart, and the headline said, Nigeria terrorists disguised themselves as Christians before opening fire in church, killing over 50. I brought that up this morning, just a little while ago, in our What's Concerning Us, because, you know, we have to be prepared. We have to, know what threats we're going to be facing in our summer of rage, which will never be as bad as what the Nigerians face on a daily basis. So how are Nigerians supposed to defend themselves in the midst of all of this?
Well, this is the problem, because as you noted, they came in disguised. If they had come in with their guns blazing, they would have killed some people, but probably a lot more people would have been able to get away. But they waded through a large part of the mass. And so nobody had any reason to think they were anything but Catholics. And this kind of thing could happen anywhere. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, said war is deceit. And he specifically allowed for deceiving unbelievers in circumstances of war. Now, the Nigerian Christians don't think of themselves as being at war, but unfortunately, the Fulani do. And so they have no trouble with this kind of act of deception, and we need to be aware. I'm not saying we should live in fear, but this kind of thing really could happen anywhere.
Perhaps it's time to go back to what Justin the Martyr wrote about in about 150 AD, and that not just anybody got access to the liturgy. Not just anybody could come in. You had to be vouched for. You had to be on the path, and certainly if you weren't baptized, you weren't allowed to access to the Holy Eucharist. Maybe it's time for places like Nigeria to go back to the early church and their method.
It's interesting to note that that's even in the Byzantine liturgy. The doors, it said in the middle of the Byzantine liturgy. This is a time in the old days when the doors were actually closed, and those who were not known to be members of the congregation were invited to leave. And this was a security measure at a time when the church was outlawed. And so this is something that still survives in the Eastern liturgies, and maybe you're right. Maybe this is an indication that we need to return to it.
A couple of things. One is, we traditionally, instead of liturgy of the word, liturgy of the Eucharist, it was referred to in the Roman Rite, the liturgy of the catechumens and the liturgy of the faithful. So even at the first half of Mass, you were only expected to be there if you were a catechumen, meaning they knew who you were studying to become part of the faithful. And then at the liturgy of the faithful, where they have what we call now the liturgy of the Eucharist, the catechumens were ushered out and only the faithful stayed. So that would have solved that problem. But in the Holy Land, at the Church of the Nativity, the doors were called the doors of humility, the humility doors, because the Muslims would ride in on horses and slaughter the Christians at the Church of the Nativity, which I believe are owned by the Orthodox Church. And they ended up shrinking it smaller, and so it was only people could walk in, so no horses. And then the Muslims would march people in and start slaughtering Christians again. So they shrunk it so small that only one person can fit through at a time, like crouched in. And so do you think, Robert Spencer, that this is where we're headed, that we're going to be heading back to a time in a lot of these countries, or maybe even in America, considering they're warning U.S. bishops, hey, be prepared, after Roe v. Wade comes down, there are going to be attacks. We're going to have to start moving towards these kind of ideas, these kind of practices?
Yeah, I think it's definitely coming to be a time of persecution. I can tell you actually that a few years back at my own parish, there were a couple of Muslims who started to come every Sunday. And people were disconcerted because they would come to coffee after the liturgy and start to preach to people and try to convert them to Islam. And so people were kind of scared and nervous about their being there. Now, ultimately, they stopped coming. They left a negative Yelp review, and that was the end of that. But I think that I can also tell you, I have a friend who attends a parish elsewhere in California that where there were Muslims going by and screaming Allahu Akbar during the middle of services. And
Wow.
so this kind of thing is already happening to a certain extent here. And I actually remind me, I was over in Jerusalem some years ago, and I stopped into the Melkite Greek Catholic Patriarchate in the Old City and was interrogated, essentially.
Wow.
Asked a barrage of questions. I said, I just want to go into the church here for a minute and pray. And they gave me the third degree first. They
Yeah.
don't just let anybody in.
They're not
And
dumb.
they have that by grim necessity.
Yeah, I mean, we was it a month ago? There was the gentleman, running through the streets, shooting people, shooting Jews randomly. They have to live with this. They're not dumb. They understand that security is such a big thing. But unfortunately, one of the thoughts I had over the weekend was, there aren't any more Christian nations, Christian kingdoms to come to the rescue of Christians who are being martyred. We're a post-Christendom society. It doesn't exist, and even if they did, I mean, France didn't want to participate, in the last round, Lepanto, because they were doing deals with the Ottoman Turks, right? So we live in such a strange world where even Christians seemingly don't care, or maybe they're just so disinterested. It's just so far removed from their world that they pay little attention or don't really care about the suffering of so many around the world. We haven't made in comparison.
Well, there's no doubt about that, Joe. And also, I think that unfortunately, the desire for dialogue itself can interfere with this. And this is something that I have experienced myself. I was invited a few years back, I won't name the diocese, to speak at a Catholic men's conference. And the bishop canceled me. He said, to speak about the persecution of Christians by Muslims will harm the dialogue we're having with Muslims. And I thought, well, this is kind of ironic, really, because what good is the dialogue if it doesn't stop the persecution, or if it just all it ends up doing is silencing Christians who speak about the persecution? And so that was a shame. But I think that a lot of Christian Catholic leaders think, not just Catholics, but Christians of all kinds, think this is something we just must not talk about because we have these conferences with Muslims and this will ultimately solve the problem. And there's no evidence that this dialogue has ever solved anything or will ever solve anything.
Going back to the president, Buhari, apparently he was scheduled to have some sort of event, dinner or whatever with his government that afternoon, later that day, which he never canceled, in spite of the fact that he did tour the devastation of this church, which they let off a bomb and then they started shooting people. And as you described earlier, the bloodshed was horrific. Well, he saw that and he went on to have this dinner, this meeting with his cabinet or his government. And the video of him laughing, joking, pretending as though everything is great and there's no problem in the world, that was kind of disturbing to see.
It was chilling. And it's an indication that those who claim that he's a Fulani and he doesn't care about Fulani violence, they have a point. And, I have a long list at Jihad Watch of statements from the Nigerian government. We're moving briskly against these terrorists and we're eliminating them. And it's all just words. And that's all we've ever gotten. They strike with virtual impunity. You'd be amazed how often they strike. This was a particularly virulent strike, but Christians are being killed on a near daily basis in Nigeria, and Buhari does nothing.
Yeah.
What blows my mind, Mr. Spencer, is the idea that all these things is not ever covered by any media. And I'm surprised by it because you would think, especially in America, where we seem to be obsessed with race and see if if a black person is killed in America, well, then there's like other riots that are happening. But if a African dies by murder, then nobody seems to care if they're Christians. So what explains that? Is it that Muslims rank higher on the category of oppressed people for the left, or what explains that?
You hit it, Adrian. That's it. In the first place, if the Fulani were white and their victims black, then we would hear about it. But since the Fulani are black and their victims are black, it doesn't fit any establishment media narrative. The narrative that the establishment media has followed for years in covering jihad attacks or ignoring jihad attacks around the world is that Muslims are victims. And if you can portray Muslims as victims, then the story gets reported. But if there's no Muslims or victims angle, the story does not get reported. You might think, oh, I'm being hyperbolic, I'm exaggerating. Look, I challenge you to look back at the coverage of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and you will see story after story after story from AP, the BBC, Reuters, the New York Times, CNN, all about how Muslims suffered after 9/11. And there was nary a story about the ongoing jihad or the continuing victims of jihad or jihad attacks in Africa or Asia or Europe or anywhere else since 9/11. There was nothing. It was all about how Muslims suffered from Islamophobia in the United States after 9/11.
And that reminds me, when you're saying that, my friend of mine is going to school. She wants to be a social worker. She wants to help people. And she didn't realize how absolutely woke the social worker industry is. In one of her classes, she spent days going over how Christians are very privileged and the different other religions are oppressed by Christians in America. And it spent days talking about this. Yet it seems that it's the exact opposite's the case. How can this seemingly a very clear thing that's not true? I mean, Bible's banned from school, but you can teach the Quran in school. The Bible is banned from the public square, but Muslims can dress in traditional Muslim dress in public square, but Christians, God forbid, you try to do anything. What explains that as well of the advancement of Muslims in the public square?
Well, I think the only thing that explains it ultimately, Adrian, and I don't mean to just give a flip pietistic answer here, but the only thing that explains it is the gospel. And the world will hate you. It hated me first. The last will be first, and the first last. And so it's no surprise, really, that the world would be so upside down, and these groups that are called marginalized would be actually privileged, and the groups that are called privileged would be actually marginalized. Mm-hmm. This is the situation that the Lord told us the world would be in, and here we are.
Okay, so we have a couple of minutes left with Robert Spencer. We have the stories of the daughters, these girls that were kidnapped and sold and married off, underage in most cases, converted to Islam and all of that. That continues today. Why do these people stay there? Why do they stay when they're being slaughtered, their children abducted, murdered, or what have you? Why not just leave?
Well, ultimately, a lot of them are going to leave. There's no doubt about that. But this is their home. This is where they've always lived. And so you have a group of people that is doing all this in order to drive them out. Then human nature, a lot of people are going to say, well, we're not going to give in to that. We're not going to acquiesce to this bullying and intimidation. We're going to stand our ground. But, I'm speaking to you today because my grandparents were exiled after declining to convert to Islam in the old Ottoman Empire. And there are millions of us in the West who ultimately determined that it was better just to leave. But we're going to run out of places to go.
Yeah, that's coming too. Okay, so last question then. Why don't they stand up and fight back? Why don't they raise a Christian army and defend themselves?
Well, here you have a real issue with funding and the fact that these groups are well heeled. The Fulani and the Boko Haram group and the other jihadis in the region all somehow have the best weaponry and unlimited ammunition, no trouble getting anything. But the Christians, on the other hand, they don't have this kind of international backing. And so that in itself is a story. Who's paying for all this?
Yeah.
And I think we would find, if there were able to be an investigation conducted of it, that well-heeled Muslims who believe in this jihad are financing these groups, and the Christians don't have that.
Insane. Robert Spencer, jihadwatch.org. Thank you for your time today. God bless you. God love you. Have a great day, sir.
Thank you.
Let's pray for those suffering in Nigeria. Let's pray that God will give them relief and mercy. Let's pray for the total conversion of Muslims as well before it's too late. We're going to say goodbye for today in this hour, but if you want to join us for a second hour, go tune in at grnonline.com/TDT at 9 a.m. Central.